What's up, everyone? If you've clicked on this video, then you know that we are going to be talking about Fairy Tale by Stephen King today. Go ahead and show you the book cover there. It's a very beautiful cover. It's perfect for a modern fantasy, in my opinion. But this is Stephen King's newest novel. It's pretty slow and it's steady, but it creates like one of the most wonderful fantasy worlds that I've experienced in a long time. He's going to have another novel coming out, I think, in September called Holly. I don't know anything about it because I haven't read anything that includes Holly as a character yet. But hopefully, I'm going to catch up on that. I should have plenty of time to read all the books that include her. That way, as soon as Holly comes out, I can also pick up that novel. But I will tell you that this book is not horror. If it wasn't obvious, some people think that Stephen King only writes horror, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. Especially his more modern books, he writes a lot of different stuff. So if you've never read Stephen King, but you are thinking about it, or it interests you at all, then this might be the perfect first book for you. It definitely represents some of his best work, at least in my opinion. He really shines when he writes like longer books, and this one comes in at 600 pages. So if you've ever thought about reading Stephen King, you might want to think about picking this up. I've heard this book described as a love letter to H.P. Lovecraft and the Brothers Grimm. If you're unfamiliar with those authors, H.P. Lovecraft wrote a lot of cosmic horror, and just because I say it's horror doesn't mean that this book actually includes H.P. Lovecraft's horror elements. It includes a few elements that H.P. Lovecraft is really known for, but it's not scary by any means. And then the Brothers Grimm, they are obviously known for fairy tales that we know today, like Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood, things like that. So that's kind of the vibe you're going to get if you jump into this book. So I wanted to read you guys the synopsis, the little few paragraphs that are in this little inside cover. But instead of reading that, I think I'm actually going to read this back blurb, which is actually the first few paragraphs of the actual book. If you haven't read the synopsis, I'd recommend skipping it because there's some stuff in the synopsis that doesn't happen until like halfway through the book. And I feel like you don't really need to read it to know if you're going to enjoy this or not. Just know that it's a modern fairy tale by Stephen King. That's really all you need to know. So if you haven't read the synopsis, go ahead and skip that. But if you have read it, then I still think you're going to enjoy it. But I feel like these first few paragraphs here will give you plenty of insight into whether you're going to enjoy it. So with that being said, let me go ahead and read this for you. I'm sure I can tell this story. I'm also sure no one will believe it. That's fine with me. Telling it will be enough. My problem, and I'm sure many writers have it, not just newbies like me, is deciding where to start. My first thought was with the shed, because that's where my adventures really began. But then I realized I would have to tell about Mr. Bowditch first, and how we became close. Only that never would have happened except for the miracle that happened to my father. A very ordinary miracle, you could say. One that's happened to many thousands of men and women since 1935, but it seemed like a miracle to a kid. Only that isn't the right place either, because I don't think my father would have needed a miracle if it hadn't been for that goddamn bridge. So that's where I need to start, with the goddamn Sycamore Street Bridge. And now, thinking of those things, I see a clear thread leading up through the years to Mr. Bowditch and the plaid-locked shed behind his ramshackle old Victorian. But a thread is easy to break, so not a thread but a chain, a strong one. And I was the kid with the shackle clamped around his wrist. So I hope that little blurb interested you enough to want to read the story. I went into the store to buy this, and I knew I was going to buy it regardless because it's Stephen King. But, I decided to read the first few paragraphs anyway and not even knowing that it was on the back. And I was like immediately hooked, and it kept me hooked for pretty much the entire story. So if those few paragraphs made you want to continue reading, then I'm pretty sure you're going to like the rest of the book as well. So let's get into actually specifically what I liked about it. The world that Stephen King built is really a magical, beautiful, like wonderful place. It's not as expansive as something like, what you're going to get from A Song of Ice and Fire or Lord of the Rings. But it's also not that type of fantasy. It's more like a fairy tale fantasy, like I said, Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood. It's that type of world, not the world of like dragons and stuff like that. All in all, I think if Stephen King wanted to, he could really expand this world, but I don't think he's going to. He wrapped it up really nicely at the end, so I think he's probably done with this world, which is kind of a shame, but I don't think it really needs to be improved upon or anything. I think it works perfectly as a standalone novel. And if you're an animal lover, you'll love the fact that this book includes a dog named Radar, which is pretty much a sidekick to the main character. He plays a pretty integral part to the story. And I don't have a dog right now, but I used to, and I want to get another one in the future. So that was definitely a pro for me. So if you like animals and you like stories that include animal companions, then that will be another good thing that you can look forward to. Also, everyone, did you know that this book is written by Stephen King? And I actually put that down here as a pro on what I liked about it. And I know that's kind of cheating because I'm just a huge Stephen King fan. And if you've never read him, that probably means nothing to you. And that's completely fine if that means nothing to you. But just know that because it's written by Stephen King, that is another thing I really like about it. Stephen King just has a certain way of writing. This book was very slow and steady. So because it was Stephen King's writing, it just flowed so well for me. And I couldn't like put it down. If it had been another writer, I feel like maybe it would have been a little bit boring, but I just really enjoyed the fact that Stephen King can keep you interested, even if he's saying almost nothing. And then finally, the last thing I want to mention as far as what I liked is the ending. He really wrapped it up nicely. I could kind of see it coming, but I was a little bit worried that Stephen King was going to try and do something crazy and throw you off. But I think it's the perfect ending for a modern fairy tale. You know, knowing Stephen King, he might do something a little bit different, you know, something you don't expect. Stephen King's kind of hit or miss with his endings, and I know a lot of people just absolutely hate a lot of his endings. But he really did a great job here, and I wouldn't change a thing about it. So there are really only a couple things that I didn't like. And if you disregard the first one, which I'll get to that in a second, but if you disregard the first one, there's really only one thing I didn't like about the book. The first thing I have here is that it didn't feel like it was written by a 17-year-old teenager, and that's the perspective that it's supposed to be written from. But the reason I don't consider that a con anymore is the fact that Stephen King actually addressed it at the end. He pretty much read my mind and addressed the fact that on why it doesn't feel like it's written by a teenager. So I'm going to cross that off, but I wanted to mention it to you guys at least. And then the second thing is at the 75% mark, something happens that I think was actually supposed to be like one of the most intense moments of the whole story. But to me, it just felt kind of dull and boring. And I kind of wanted to get back to the other stuff. For most of the book, it was very slow, steady, like fairy tale-esque. However, this one intense moment that happened for a little while just wasn't really doing it for me. It's kind of like ironic because it's like the reverse of what you would expect. The most intense moment is like the most boring for me. But once I got over that and I got more to the ending, everything like wrapped up perfectly. That's a little bit nitpicky, but overall the book was like really amazing. And if you are looking for a modern telling of a fairy tale, or if you've read any other Stephen King and you're okay with reading non-horror, then this would be the perfect book for you. Before I get into who should actually read this book, I want to mention that if you are liking the video, please hit the like button. And if you want to see more content, hit subscribe. Also, let me know your thoughts on the book in the comments below. Okay, so who should actually read this? I think anyone that is looking for a modern fairy tale would, this would be like the perfect book for them. You don't have to have read any Stephen King to really enjoy this. Just be aware that it is on the longer side a little bit. It's like 600 pages. So if you're used to books that are like 250 to 350 pages, this might be a little bit long for you. However, this is probably about average for Stephen King. He writes everything from like 300 pages to like 1,000 pages. So if you're okay with that though, and you're looking for a modern fairy tale, you know, you might want to give this a try. And then also know that it's not horror just because it's Stephen King. So if you are looking for another horror Stephen King book, then this might not be for you. But if you're okay with reading some Stephen King that is not scary, then check it out. All right, everyone, I really appreciate you watching. That's my book review, and I will see you next time.